From the world's most prolific serial killer to France's most notorious serial killer who murders by a lethal injection. Honestly, these serial killers are going to give you some chills. First, let's look at how this American killer executed his murder. Number 10. Jeffrey Dahmer. If you've never met a living monster, or let's just say a vampire, then you're about to meet one. Jeffrey Dahmer committed so many horrific acts that it seems like he must have lost the meaning of life and humanity along the way. He started a horrific killing spree while still a teenager, and it all continued into his adulthood. His target was mainly men and boys. He would pick up his victims from gay bars and drive them home before murdering them by strangulation. He continued his wicked acts until 1991, when he enticed Tracy Edwards to his apartment with the promise of beer and payment for photographs. Edwards sensed danger and managed to escape, and when he tipped the police, Dahmer's apartment was searched, and what was discovered inside shocked the whole nation. Several remains of human body parts were discovered in his home. The reason why he kept the body parts in his home, I don't know. I think he must have been a cannibal. Dahmer was arrested and convicted of 15 murders, and he was then sentenced to life imprisonment. His horrific story attracted media attention, and he has been interviewed on several accounts while in prison. However, he died in prison after being attacked by a fellow inmate, bringing an end to America's most notorious killer. Number 9. Pedro Lopez. Colombian Pedro Lopez is one man you would wish to never make contact with, because you never know, you might just be the next victim on his list. Pedro Lopez was a notorious killer across South America, and his horrific acts earned him the nickname of the Monster of the Andes. He used to prey on young girls from 1969 and would even cross borders in neighboring countries to accomplish his unspeakable crimes. However, he was uncovered in 1980 after a failed attempt to abduct someone. He was arrested, and after investigation, he was charged with 110 homicides, although Lopez claimed to have killed over 300 children. At first, the police were skeptical of his confession until a flash flood uncovered some of his burial sites. Lopez was later released in 1998 for good behavior, but he would later commit another murder in 2002, and since then, no one knows his whereabouts. Number 8. Luis Garavito. Forget about Pedro Lopez. Here is another Colombian serial killer who takes the record for the highest known victim count. Luis Garavito, nicknamed the Beast, confessed to having preyed upon and brutalized over 400 children and teenagers across Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Garavito suffered a violent childhood, and this is probably why he ended up turning into a monster, terrorizing children in his homeland. He not only tortured these children, but he would rape them before murdering them. When he was eventually arrested in 1999, he was charged with the murder of 138 minors and sentenced to 1,853 years in prison. However, after confessing more victims and leading the police to the site where he buried the bodies, his sentence was reduced to 22 years. Number 7. Robert Hansen. Ever wondered how good men turn evil and start hounding people? Well, probably a hostile childhood can play a part in that, and sure enough, the case of Robert Hansen is no different. Hansen was born into a rough home, and so to escape the hostility at home, he would spend most of his childhood hunting in the nearby forests. I'm not sure whether or not to call him a feral child, but when he became an adult, he would end up adopting animal behaviors and start hunting down fellow humans. Even though he maintained a wholesome reputation in his town, his dark side was more dominant in the woods of Alaska. He would target drunk women or sex workers and abduct them before driving or flying them into the forest. It's here where Hansen would rape his victims before murdering them in a gruesome manner. For a whole decade throughout the 70s and early 80s, Hansen continued hunting down victims of this gender and toying with their lives. It wasn't until 1983 that one of his victims managed to escape and reported him to the authorities. The FBI would eventually hunt down this evil man, and it was then that his atrocities became public. He confirmed having assaulted and killed at least 17 women, and even took investigators to where he had buried their remains. Nicknamed Butcher Baker by the media, Hansen was imprisoned for 461 years and died in prison while serving the sentence. Number 6. Albert Fish. About a century ago, Albert Fish roamed the streets of New York City targeting children to murder them and feed on their remains. Fish was a heartless cannibal. He not only tortured his victims, but sexually assaulted them before strangling them to death. His evil acts earned him many nicknames, including the Gray Man and the Boogeyman, among others. He was so daring that at one point he wrote a letter to the mother of one of his victims describing what he had done to the child. However, his gruesome acts didn't last long, and 10 years after he started the acts, he was finally arrested in 1934. He confessed to having killed over 100 victims. He was sentenced to execution for the murders he committed. Number 5. Israel Keyes. Of all the serial killers on this list, perhaps Israel Keyes must have been the most dangerous of all. Can you imagine dealing with a soldier turned serial killer? With all the skills gained from the US Army, Israel Keyes decided to become hungry for human blood. He would travel across state lines to find his victims. And to make his work easier, Keyes would begin his mission by setting up kill kits in different parts of the country to allow him to get easy access to equipment to commit crimes. He would play mind games with the authorities as he continued taking away people's lives. Eventually, his evil acts came to an end after he was arrested in connection to the abduction and murder of a young woman, Samantha Koenig. The FBI traced down the account he used to solicit ransom and were able to arrest and lock him into custody. Investigators grilled him for days, and it was discovered that Keyes was a serial killer who murdered multiple victims. Number 4. David Parker Ray. If there is one daring killer on this list, then it must be David Parker Ray. This American kidnapper and serial killer modified a trailer inside his Elephant Butte home and labeled it a toy box. It's no wonder he was nicknamed Toy Box Killer. The trailer was soundproofed and contained all the instruments he would need to commit crimes. Ray would kidnap, rape, and torture women inside the trailer before ending their lives. And even though his wife Cynthia Hendy was aware of his evil acts, she never reported him, probably because she was also threatened. Ray continued torturing and murdering dozens of women from the mid-80s to 1999, when finally New Mexico authorities nabbed him after one of his victims managed to escape and reported the incident. The police quickly arrested Ray and his wife, and even though no bodies were found, Ray was accused by his accomplices of killing several women. He was sentenced to 224 years in jail, and his wife, who testified against him, was slammed with 36 years imprisonment. Even though it's not clear the actual number of women that Ray murdered, it's estimated he must have killed over 60 women. Number 3. Harold Shipman. While doctors are supposed to be our closest confidants when we are sick, it turns out that some, like Harold Shipman, are not the kind you can trust. Shipman was an ordinary general practitioner in England, but with a hunger for human blood. He would take people under his care, but not with any good intention. His intention was simply to end their lives. And sure enough, he was successful at this. He murdered many patients without being discovered. It wasn't until 1998 when a patient died under him, and a will that the family knew nothing about indicated that the deceased patient had gifted Shipman a lot of cash. However, when police investigated the matter, it was discovered that the will contained a lot of forgeries. On further investigation, it was discovered that Shipman used to end the lives of his patients by overdosing them with diamorphine. Shipman was charged in 1999 with the murder of 15 patients, a majority of whom were elderly women. After he was sentenced to life, though, he confessed to having murdered over 250 patients. Number 2. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy is probably the most notorious serial killer in the history of America. Disguised as a humble clown performer who used to entertain people at parties and events under the stage name of Pogo the Clown, nobody would have expected this man to be a serial killer. But in the 1970s, Americans were left in shock when it turned out that John Wayne Gacy was just a devil in disguise. This guy was a rampant killer of boys and men. Gacy was a builder from a suburb of Chicago and used to lure his victims to his home, pretending to be a police officer or promising them work. Eventually, he would rape, torture, and murder them. On realizing that the police were hunting him, Gacy went ahead to confess his horrific crimes through his lawyers. This gave the police a great opportunity to search his home for possible evidence, and honestly, what the police discovered in his home was horrific. Remains of his victims lay all over the house. He was convicted of 33 murders and sentenced to death in 1980. However, it was not until 14 years later that he was executed by lethal injection. Number 1. Marcel Petiot. When you live in a country where persecution is the order of the day, it becomes easy to fall prey to any scheme that promises to help you escape into exile. And that's how Marcel Petiot, one of France's most notorious serial killers, took advantage of desperate citizens attempting to escape France in the 1940s when Germany invaded France. He established himself as a member of the resistance and promised those leaving Nazi-occupied France a safe escape to other countries. However, he would end up inoculating his victims, who would afford his exorbitant fee of $500,000 with lethal injection before stealing their possessions and disposing of their bodies. Operating under the pseudonym of Dr. Eugene, Petiot managed to murder over 60 victims. Petiot was finally nabbed after 26 bodies were discovered floating in the Seine River. In 1946, he was tried with 135 criminal charges and convicted of 26 murders and sentenced to beheading. Thank you for watching.